effect on what's happening in Southern California. And what I would like to do is I'm going to start out just by going down and letting each person introduce themselves and tell us a little bit who they are and what company or organization they're with, and then we'll jump into it.
Thanks, John. My name is Kimball Ratliff. I'm here today from the National Multifamily Housing Council in Washington, D.C. We are a federal trade association representing all of the participants in the multifamily ecosystem. So it's owners, developers, and operators, folks in the finance space, and then the service providers as well.
And my name is Tom Bannon. I'm the Executive Director of the California Apartment Association. We're a statewide trade association. Do a lot of lobbying at the state level as well as at the local level, and engage in political activities for the industry.
Good afternoon, Henry Manuchery, Chairman and CEO of Universe Holdings. We are a hardcore operator of value-add apartments, primarily in the Southern California market from San Diego to Santa Barbara. And in a portfolio of several thousand units, we have about 1,000 rentable apartments, about 30 properties. So I give an operator's insight into that. And recently, as a defense measure, as a matter of diversification, we opened our New York office and are making our first acquisition in the northern seaboard, which we'll get into later as some of the comparisons for markets.
Okay. And I'm Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, which is a research center on real estate matters. I'm also a professor in the Price School of Public Policy and the Marshall School of Business at USC.
So if you sit through this, 2 credits. So if we take a step back, I mean, we are dealing with, and we've been talking about this all day, job growth and household growth has continued to expand at a much faster rate than the number of new units we're bringing in, and the new units we're bringing in are Class A. There's no expansion in the really the workforce housing sector, which is what has put so much pressure on that sector. But if I could take a little bit of a step back from that, kind of how did we get here? How did we get to the point that we're dealing with so much concern about rent control? And if I could just open that up, and Richard, let me have you from I guess an academic standpoint, get your perspective on that.
So the last time California was affordable, which is to say you took the median renter and you put them in the median rental unit, and they'd spend less than 30% of their income on rent, was back in the 1970s. And things have gotten worse and then better, and then worse, and then better, and then worse. It's when we've had recessions. Ironically, recessions help affordability, because you have unemployment, you have some people moving out, and so on. But between about 2010 and 2016, things got considerably worse as rent rose much faster than incomes. Now, what a lot of people don't know is since 2016, things have actually improved a little bit because wages are rising and rents haven't risen quite as much, but things are still bad. I mean, so the typical renter in Southern California, or I should say Los Angeles and Orange County, is spending roughly 43% of their income on rent, and we generally look at 30% as affordable, maybe 33, that's an arbitrary number, but what we know is 43% is not affordable. And again, it's gotten worse over people's lifetimes, and given what people were used to paying at one point, if they've been here for a while and the rent goes up, that gets them upset. As the reason for this, I think John brought up an important point about lack of building, and part of the reason for that is it's very expensive to build in LA, and I want to work through what that means. So, the median household in Los Angeles County makes about $60,000 a year. That means that they can afford rent of $1,500 a month. That's 30% of their income. So that's top line income of $18,000 a year. Take out about a third of that for expenses, that's $12,000 a year net. Cap that at 5%, which is about right. And what you get is that unless you can build for less than 240,000 a unit, you're not going to build because to that income level, because you're not making the return that you need. And again, I'm not talking about extraordinary returns. I'm talking about basically sort of 5% return on cost. So that's a really pretty modest return. Now, part of this is because LA is a global coastal city, and global coastal cities have expensive land San Francisco's like this, Hong Kong's like this, New York is like this, London, okay, it's on the Thames, not quite on the coast, but for all intents and purposes, it's a global coastal city, yeah. And so that's something you're fighting when you're in a successful city on a coast. But that said, there are a lot of policy reasons why we can't bring in that unit for anything like 240,000. It's more like 450 is the minimum cost to build. And those are policy, and it's things like impact fees, it's things like parking requirements and the nature of the parking requirements. And so on top of the land being expensive, we make it, and in fact in LA, we have this brilliant thing, I don't know if you're familiar with it, we actually charge people to build residential buildings in order to make housing quote unquote more affordable. Which is like, if you have a food crisis, you tax farmers for growing wheat, right? We're gonna tax you $1 a bushel for your wheat so that we can give people money to buy wheat. So there are lots of costs of doing business here that make it impossible to deliver anything remotely like, let alone affordable, something that's available at the middle of the income distribution.
So if we, Kimball, from a national perspective within MHC, California and LA aren't the only cities that are really struggling with this.
That's right. So while I think most folks associate this housing affordability crisis most frequently with Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, Seattle, and then a series of the cities on the eastern coast as well, we're actually seeing this all over the United States. And it's not an urban problem alone. It's actually the affordability crisis is, I think, happening the place in the place that most shocks people is in suburbs, is in middle-class suburbs, and even in rural communities today. And so this is where I think NMHC has seen the need for more of a federal role or intervention. Is the reality that this is not, while I think certainly Professor Green and I think a lot of folks would tell you that the challenge is most acute in 6 states, it is not absent in any of the 50. And so because of that, we as a federal organization see a role in encouraging federal policymakers to push down better policies, look for more resources to address this problem nationally.
So Tom, in the state of California, I mean, there are some laws getting passed right now. There are some things in queue. There are some, I don't want to say, I'm hesitant to use imminent danger, but we're have some current fights going on. What are some of the things that your office is working with right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would probably add to the professor's comments, Kimball's comments, that in California, the other issue that we've got is that we've got the California Environmental Quality Act, which aside from the fees and aside from, just the zoning issues, in California, we've basically got CEQA, which allows neighbors, homeowners, anybody that has an interest in participating in debating a project, basically they come out in force. And it's not unusual for projects that have maybe been designed to build 20 units per acre, end up at maybe 10 units per acre at best. And that's really to pacify sort of the homeowners, those folks that we call NIMBYs, not in my backyard. In response to your question, John, first I do want to make one quick sort of advertisement for Marcus and Millichap, and we'll talk more about Prop 10. But I do have to tell all of you that the whole Prop 10 thing was very, very difficult. We spent almost $65 million. When I was going to buy the TV time, you have to buy that TV time relatively early, and we had to start making buys of like $3 million, $4 million, and $5 million. And to get those commitments were not easy early on in the campaign. I will tell you that Marcus and Millichap stepped up and sort of led the charge. I was able to sleep at night thanks to John and Asim, because they stepped up very, very early. So, and a number of people in this room did the same thing, but you didn't ask me to tell you that, but just so you know, and thank you very much.
Okay, I appreciate that.
In terms of
I wasn't going to stop you either. I mean, you were.
Hey, that sounds great. That sounds great. The other thing I would say in terms of legislation, yes, it is about supply. This is not rocket science for normal people to understand that that's why we've got the problem that we've got. I mean, it just is not that difficult. There's a number of bills. There's one bill in particular, Senate Bill 50, which we were one of the co-sponsors of. It was sort of Gavin Newsom's effort to build the millions of units that he thinks needs to be built. Unfortunately, the bill carried by Senator Wiener out of San Francisco, which really would have preempted local governments from stopping apartment construction next to transit centers, failed. And you think to yourself, wait a minute, this is a supply issue and we can't get beyond the local control issue that is problematic. So from our perspective, that probably typifies the biggest problem we've got in California, the inability for developers, investors to build. And when you have a rational bill that basically says you cannot preclude and you gotta encourage multifamily construction next to transit centers, and you can't get that bill through the legislature, that gives you a perspective in terms of what we're dealing with. So that's one of the big ones.
Henry, you're up here representing the investor side of the equation. How has your approach to acquisitions changed over the last couple of years as this has become more prominent discussion? And when you look at other markets, although you said you opened another office in New York, but they have rent control too. So I mean, I would
Not, we don't mind New York City, outside.
But what is, from your perspective as an owner, what are, first of all, what is your, are you still looking to buy, or are you still moving in that direction? And what are some of the current real concerns that you're having on a day-to-day operation standpoint?
Okay, I want to start by mentioning some live examples. Let's just take the city of Inglewood and Glendale, residents, everybody here. We were early in the game in Inglewood, 2014. We bought 9 buildings, and what we predicted happened. Rents in some cases doubled, about 2.5 times. It's a lot of money, and all of a sudden there's an emergency city council meeting around March 4th where the mayor comes out and says, I'm tired of getting all these calls from my constituents, people who put me into office, and boom, overnight they enact this temporary restraining order that can only raise rents 5%. And then they're going to have a review, and that was supposed to be 45 days, now it's extended for another 2 months. I think it's coming up June 15th. So right off the bat, they dropped the bomb over there. And that was, thank God, with stuff that we had done, we were 98% completed with all turns. And the first thing we did is immediately gave everyone a 5% rent increase, irregardless, which people paid. The second thing that did is make every vacancy we had more valuable because the decontrol was still in place. But thirdly, what it fundamentally did is changed our underwriting from underwriting a non-rent control market and non-rent control building into a rent control market with putting aside, besides 20 or 25,000 a year, I'm using an example as a number, sometimes as high as 30, 35, because some of these buildings were in dilapidated condition we bought. But we said, okay, put aside $13,000, $14,000 for buying tenants out in case you have to pay relocation fees, and then do not come up with these crazy assumptions that the rents are going to grow, and they're going to go, they're going to double. Rise it 5% and see how the underwriting change, and that immediately produced a lesser price per unit and a lesser price for these properties. It became almost like a controlled rent control type underwriting. So we did that, and we see that across the board. We were not going to pay these crazy prices, and thank God we passed on a few opportunities where people were paying $300, $340, $350 a door. We sort of stopped at $260 a door. We just put a 10th property in escrow that we went hard on a couple of days ago. We're paying $230 a door for that property, and we think it's a spectacular buy. The narrative hasn't changed. What's happening with the city and all the expansion is still going through, but we've adjusted the way we think. And if somebody else wants to be a Meshuggah, be crazy, and can't pay more money, and just dream and do these things, is fine. Secondly, what is really causing this kind of anger amongst tenants who run to the city? Mayor Butts, when I spoke to him at the council meeting, imagine me walking this meeting with a constituency of a different type of race, coming guys and coming to I had to go hide in a corner. But after I went up to him and said, you know, what's going on here, man? We're spending money here. Do you want us to go away? You know, you got, you know, $4 billion stadium at Hollywood Park coming in, and what's going on over here? And what I found out, not really from him, but from a good friend, is that a couple of young guys, God bless them for all their tenacity, had come in, bought a couple buildings in that market, and they had given tenants, every single tenant, 160% rent increase. So that's nice, depends on what kind of investment money you have. If you give people promises of fast returns in a short time, maybe you need to do that, but that's just stupid. You just don't do that. So, and the mayor says, I called this guy, I pleaded, I begged with him, I said, have some mercy on these people, you know, raise them 10%, 20%, 25%. No, we're gonna go all the way through. So what that did is, this became an item that got blogged on the internet, and then more people joined the movement. They printed these increases, rent increase notices on, you know, on these blogs, and people became crazy. When we bought our properties, and we're gonna do this in the future in other markets, like, you know, Santa Barbara right now is going through the same kind of a discussion, the same kind of a narrative. Imagine Santa Barbara where there's so much money, you know, homes at what, $30, $40 million in the water? They're talking about rent control. It doesn't make any sense. So what we did is, it's, as an operator, what I can advise the crowd is, if you're going to do rent increases, do it in phases. You know, take the lowest paying ones, you know, raise them a couple $100, then the next year, and this way, as you improve your properties, put money into the amenities. Create a nice rec room if you can. Build a gym if you can. Paint the building. Fix the pool area. Do the landscaping. Offer the tenants something that says, you know what, we're taking care of the community, and then they will come to you and they will not leave, and they'll say, hey, can I move to a rehab unit? Well, it's gonna be $1,000 more. Oh, okay, I'll pay it. You know, because there's no alternative. So that's sort of.
But what is going to happen, which, by the way, as a side note, I was talking, I'm not gonna point him out, but I was talking to somebody earlier today who bought a property in, I think, the same community you were just talking about, and went to the tenants and offered them $10,000 a piece to move out, and the mayor's office called him and said they should ask for more. The mayor's office was calling the tenants and saying, you should ask for 20, which I find insane. But question, do you have the ability under rent control and under what they're doing to do a value add play? Can you go in and improve a unit and raise that to market level, or are you going to be hindered in your ability to do that?
If you look at the classic area control buildings today, upon vacancy, you have decontrol. So you could go spend all the money you want in the unit and you'll get the market price. Now, what people don't realize is two things are happening. Number one, the rent control buildings have a lot of what I call trapped upside. Now, if you have patient money like we do, with our investors, we will wait 5 years. We don't need to buy anybody out. We'll wait because there are events in a person's life. People get sick, they get a job, they get married, they get divorced, they have kids, you know, they grow up, or they become more stupid, they go the other way, but people end up moving. You know, no one really stays forever unless, yeah, there are tenants we have that been there 30, 40 years, but we have that under category. You know, in our underwriting, we figure that we're gonna have what we call a 10%, 15% entrapment, that these people will never move. But we've seen our rent control portfolio that 20 to 27% is a very realistic underwriting in LA as far as people moving out.
So and I'll open this up to everybody, is this the new norm? Is rent control and tenants' rights, and we will tell you how much you can raise rents, and you've got vacancy control, or maybe you don't have vacancy control. Is this what we have to look forward to for, you know, forever?
Yeah, just if I may add one remark to that was part of, sorry for interrupting, is that today, people who have bought in the past 10 years non-rent control buildings, on average in LA, you're paying about $100,000 to $150,000 more per door for a non-rent control building. So that is going to be a very different valuation a year from now if you have some kind of rent control in place. Something to keep in mind.
Right. Okay.
So I'll say two things about whether or not this is the new normal. The first being that, and I haven't looked at my phone in 15 minutes, but I think around 24 folks right now are running in the Democratic primary to challenge President Trump in 2020. Of that group, almost 3/4 of them have already talked about housing and housing affordability as a key component of their platform. This, for a lot of the folks in this room, I imagine, is extraordinarily unique. Which is to say, I cannot remember a major candidate from either party talking about housing on the campaign trail, certainly in my professional life. So whether or not this issue of housing affordability is the new normal in terms of its focus in our public discourse, I think the answer is yes. Moreover, 2 of those Democratic candidates have already overtly endorsed national rent control. So is this the new normal here in California and nationally? I would say yes. Beyond that, I think rent control, not unlike some of these eviction protections that you're seeing simultaneously in a lot of these debates in cities and states all over the country, are both, I think, examples of policymakers trying to address symptoms of a housing affordability crisis in terms of getting at the housing affordability crisis itself. And so I say that to say, until we actually start to proactively get at housing affordability and the sort of individual rent burdens or household cost burdens that American families are facing today, this problem is not going away. As you see that number get better, maybe you'll see this issue go away, but not until then.
So let's use that as a transition. Why does rent control not work? What are some of the negative ramifications of rent control? And then let's talk about what we will need to do in order to resolve this issue. Professor?
Well, and by the way, despite what I'm about to say, it's not going to have any influence on any decision making. I was on a study group for Los Angeles County on rent stabilization, and I brought lots of literature and data, and I lost 7-2.
And you got kicked off?
No, I didn't get kicked out. No, actually, people like me, which tells me, no, I still talk to these people. It's just they didn't matter.
Right.
They think this is the way to go. But a couple of points I made is, first of all, what I've done is I've looked at the income distribution of people in rent-controlled and non-rent controlled units in San Francisco, Oakland, and Los Angeles, which are the 3 rent-controlled markets, rent-stabilized markets, I should say, in California, that are large enough that we have enough data that we can do this comparison. So Santa Monica has rent stabilization, but it's too small to do this sort of comparison. And if you look at the income distribution of the 2 groups, they lie on top of each other. Which say you look at a person in the lowest 25th percentile of the income distribution rent stabilized unit, they have about the same income as those in the lowest 25th in non-rent stabilized, median 75th percentile, and so on. And so what you have are people making $200,000 a year and more, and maybe in San Francisco you think, well, they still need affordable, but in Oakland and LA, who are in rent stabilized units. And so what does this do? It basically means units that should be freed up for lower income people never get freed up because people stay. Because let's say you leave college and you go into a property and you're making $45,000 a year and you have a roommate, and now it's 5-6 years later and you're making $90,000 a year, but your rent is still what it was when you moved into that apartment. Instead of saying to yourself, you know what, I'm going to move to a nicer apartment, or maybe I'm going to buy a house, you could say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to buy a BMW and stay in that unit. And so Rebecca Diamond and McQuaid at Stanford have a study that shows there are about 50,000 people who don't live in San Francisco who otherwise might because of rent stabilization. So you get the idea? So the units just aren't there for people. And so you can make, believe it or not, a social justice issue case against rent stabilization, which is it's not a targeted subsidy. By the way, on the other side of the equation, about 60% of rental properties in the US are owned by people for whom that's the only rental property they own. So maybe they're rich people, maybe they're not. Unfortunately, that we don't have data on. I would love to know that. But we know nothing about the distribution of wealth of property owners. We do know something about the distribution of incomes of renters. And to me, and by the way, I worked in the Obama administration. I consider myself a liberal Democrat. Boo now if you want. I think some redistribution. Is necessary. I'm a big fan of Section 8. But this is both inefficient and inequitable as a policy matter. But I'm also here to tell you, to people who support it, it doesn't matter what I just said.
Tom?
And I think the other issue is that we've been polling in California for the last 5 years in terms of what people think about rent control. And when we polled, we actually hired probably the 2 best pollsters in California. What you need to understand is that you always ask likely voters, because that's how you find out. What I'll tell you is that rent control is accepted by the vast majority of Californians. It's at about 63–64%. And probably what's most disconcerting, as we did the studies and we looked at the public opinion poll, is that Republicans, by the way, are becoming an endangered species in California. Even Republicans, it was almost 25–26% of Republicans supported rent control. Probably the most disconcerting thing was historically we've done very well with homeowners. Homeowners, you were in the 40% of homeowners who supported rent control. And while I come from a very political background, my job is to get votes that help the industry. So when you look over the horizon, going back to your question, are we saddled with rent control? I thought Jonathan earlier in the conference made a very passionate pitch that we are. I would probably say to you, we are, but I think it's the degree of rent control that we're going to be dealing with. And that's problematic because voters in California get it 2 ways. One, we've historically beat back rent control in city councils, and we beat back rent control in the California state legislature. What ends up happening is, because of the initiative process in California, you can basically get enough signatures and you can basically put the measure on the ballot. In Northern California, we beat back 7 rent control measures at the city council. All 7 came back from an initiative because organized tenant groups basically were able to gather enough signatures to put it on the ballot. We ended up beating 7 of those, but this is ongoing. And by the way, Prop 10, remember, we beat back the rent control measure that would have done away with Costa-Hawkins in the last legislative session, and forward came Prop 10. So what I would say to you is, this is with us, but all of you here who think that rent control is not fair and all of that, you gotta get that out of your head. From my perspective, I gotta figure out what that initiative says, and I gotta figure out whether it's a sentence or a paragraph, and we drill on that to beat it. In Prop 10, we never, ever talked about rent control. Because if we talked about rent control, we would not have beaten Prop 10.
Well, and as John knows, NMHC is doing very similar polling, message testing, and focus group work in a number of markets across the country. Most recently, we were in Seattle, Denver, and Chicago, and while the accents change a bit, the language is exactly the same. So we are now, as a federal organization, trying to think about how we need to be strategically positioning ourselves in the second and third wave states where this problem is a question of when, not if, in terms of its arrival. And we've been able to learn quite a lot from Tom and his group in the fights here in California already. But through that polling and that message testing and those focus groups, we have learned that this is very much a national phenomenon.
So let's shift a little bit to, by the way, we've got a question, lawsuit, CRA, LA, transit. That's kind of what you were talking about, man, Tom? Is that, or not? Anybody know about that lawsuit?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is a CEQA item, if I remember correctly, and the argument basically is that you're basically up against sort of, I don't want to get into it. The California Environmental Quality Act requires a environmental impact report. You basically look at the negative declarations or the impact of it, and this lawsuit is moving forward because people want to build next to transit. I think this is the one. Am I right? Somebody help me out here.
I don't know this particular suit. This one's
Okay.
new. This one's new. That
Well,
doesn't.
I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about kind of where we go from here. It's extremely important that we stay knowledgeable on what's happening in this, with this topic. But what is, in my opinion, the most important thing is how do we move forward? How do we figure out a way where both sides can come together and build more workforce housing? Because we can have this conversation forever, but it all comes down to economics. It all comes down to supply and demand. We have demand that far outpaces supply, and if we do not figure out a way to increase supply in that price range that the workforce housing can afford, then everybody's gonna lose. So Kimball, let me ask you, your thoughts on what are a couple of things that we need to do collectively in order to figure out a way to put us in a better position?
Yeah, so I think you asked sort of where we need to make the change, and I think the short answer is everywhere as an industry. We have changed our posture at the federal level just in recent years to a place where we are pushing now for more federal resources for affordable housing. We are trying to make sure that the resources that do exist are better targeted and those programs are better designed to achieve their intended outcomes. We are trying to also make sure that all federal resources that are flowing through to states and local governments come with some strings attached in terms of upgrading and improving their local regulatory environment such that they are not creating barriers or adding costs to the business of development and production of multifamily housing. But something we actually said last night that kind of struck me, and I think Henry is a great example of this, is I think that there's going to need to be a culture change a little bit in our industry where we think of ourselves as stewards of our properties and participants in our communities. Henry told us some stories last night about conversations that he had with local government officials trying to explain to them sort of the dynamics of their own housing market. These folks are not real estate professionals. They don't understand sort of what it is that drives things like a rent increase and how additional supply, while incredibly necessary, is very challenging to actually bring online. And so I think reimagining the way that we engage with our policymakers, both at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, and thinking of ourselves more as stewards of our assets, I think is going to be important.
There are two things. One is that we need additional dollars for affordable housing. When the redevelopment agencies went away and the tax increment financing went away for low and moderate income housing, that financial gap is very problematic for affordable housing builders. And second, the state's got to preempt local governments in California that would allow development to take place without locals stopping it. Those are my 2 points.
I mean, I think one thing we don't talk enough about is how bad technology is in the housing space. So one of my favorite factoids, I have a lot of them, is since World War II worldwide, manufacturing productivity has increased about 1,200%, agricultural productivity has increased about 700%, construction productivity has increased 6%. Okay, we do everything else differently from 80 years ago, except building stuff. We still have guys go out and swing hammers and put boards together, and that's great, but it means that you don't get increases in productivity. And when I visited Singapore a couple of weeks ago, and what's amazing to me is basically everything they're doing now is prefab housing. They have enormous factories in Malaysia that build apartment units in basically 3 pieces. They ship them on into Singapore, they put them on cranes, they drop them down, And so they're able to build really nice units, high-rise units in Singapore at $170,000 a unit. And by the way, Singapore is a richer country than the US, so it's not, it's like a cheap labor place or something like that. So I think we also need to rethink just the way we do our work. And that is, I understand, a really big lift. But we are so far behind the rest of the world in how we do what we do that I think we need to take some ownership of that.
Henry, any thoughts?
Which aspect of it?
Well, I know, I feel like
Good,
it's
broad.
been bouncing back and forth. I want to make sure I got you back into the conversation. You know, one of the things that you had mentioned last night that I think Tom referenced was just the fact that becoming stewards of your property. I mean, it's and taking a responsibility for that.
Let's look at two extreme examples. You know, we want to talk about affordable housing, cheap rents, rent control. People that live 34 years paying $700 a month in a $2,000 market. And let's go to some of the properties in the city. We toured a building last week called the Maslin, which is for sale now through Moran. We went to see a rent comp called the Vision on Wilshire, and then you go to 10,000 Santa Monica. Here are units where people who have money, professionals doing very well, models, you know, actors, actresses, people in the venture capital business, they're spending $8,000 to $40,000 a month, living in beautiful, brand new communities that have amenities up the wazoo. I mean, Wi-Fi everywhere, gorgeous pool, lap pool, lounge center, state-of-the-art gym, you know, floor-to-ceiling glass, all this stuff. The income is there to pay for it. So, in the alternative, if you could take and buy some of these value-add properties, we do, and basically instill those amenities, you will attract those people at probably less than half the price of what they have to pay at some of these landmark, gorgeous, brand new properties. And at the same time, if you're giving people something, and you're telling them that, look, we are adding all this value to your community, it's a much better alternative than having rent control all over the state, where what people will do is no longer put any money into the properties. I mean, some of the units I've seen the tenants vacate because somebody died after 40 years, or they moved because they became sick. You go into units, it is absolutely disgusting. I mean, you can't even breathe when you walk in there. So is this what people want to do with their life? Or they want to better their life? You want to be in this kind of a deplored environment, or do you want to be in a beautiful environment? So that's a matter of communication. But what's concerning is, as an operator, we're seeing some movements in the Hollywood market. We have a couple tenants that for lack of a better term, I call them terrorists. You know, but where every night there's one guy that sits on his computer and he complains about broken glass over here, you know, my water bill, this bill, and every time this guy writes, and these emails are so long, you probably spend a half hour reading them. He's calling us and our attorney and the manager and the poor regional manager and the next regional manager, all kinds of adjectives. And I'm just, you know, where is this anger coming from? But that's because the country, unfortunately, if you look at it, particularly younger people, is moving more and more far to the left. Right. That's a very disturbing trend. You know, my father came to the US in the 1950s, went to NYU, talked about the American dream and the great thing. He moved to California 41 years ago and started in brokerage, got here today. There was a dream. There was the quest to achieve. Now that's become an entitlement. You know, give me your money. You know, you are evil because you have money. Like Bernie Sanders, we talked about this last night, at the Walmart meeting, standing up and saying, oh, the Walton family, they're worth $174 billion, and you, Walmart, at your annual shareholders meeting, you're the largest business in America, and you employ hundreds of thousands of people. Why do you pay your people so little? You know, pay them $50 an hour. I'm like, who are you? What are you doing in this room? Walmart shareholders?
But Henry, saying these things is not going to convince anybody. It's easy to convince the people who already agree with you, but that's not, this won't work. If you're trying to stop rent control.
I'm just trying to go in the mindset and the core of the issue.
But it's important, no, it's important. If you want to stop this or ameliorate this, to listen to what people are saying, try to show some sympathy to their point of view. That doesn't mean you have to agree with it. But the reality of the life we're living right now is you can't just go say capitalism. That's not going to work anymore. And so you need to think of what are the more subtle messages that you can send about
That's
this.
where you guys come in.
And well, I mean, I'm not a politician either, but I do know what
Sound like one.
But I do know what it's like. I do know what it's like to get. I do know what it's like to get beat up in front of city council meetings.
Oh, these liberal
you know
guys,
what
we
I-
love you.
Yeah, we no. You want to be effective? You got to think about. You got to show that you understand that there are people who are hurting out there, and explain that this is not the way to help them, and that there are better ways to help them. And that's, I mean, I think also the right thing to do. So that's
Well, I don't disagree, but the other side of it has to be, and we're out of time, but we have microphones and we're gonna keep talking, they won't open the bar. But the other part of that is we have to create a solution for constructing workforce housing in large numbers. And NMHC did a study last year and determined that most new apartment construction projects, almost 35% of the cost is in soft costs. Think about that. 35% of the cost of construction. So the city comes in and says, you know, we want you to have this size floor plate and this amount of density and this amount of building height. We want you to use this material. You need to have this much green space, and all of that increases the cost. So you sharpen your pencil and you come up with your number, and then they come back and they say, well, why are you charging so much for that, right? Meanwhile, they're all the way through the process. There's impact fees, there's application fees, there's CEQA studies that have got to be done. There are, I mean, all of those utility hookup fees, all of those taxes that are part of the process. So I think the final, I guess my final comment is what needs to happen is a coming together, because we can establish both sides of the fence, right? And we understand both sides. And if you don't understand, we'll have you talk to Henry for 5 minutes and then you'll understand, right? Because he's on that side. But the point is that we do have to figure out a way to come together. We have to figure out a way for public-private partnerships, for developers to work with municipalities. And in order for this to get to a point where we can deliver units that you know, you always hear, you know, the teachers and the firemen and policemen, but workforce housing families are going to be able to live in. Just, I guess, kind of in closing, kind of rapid fire, last few comments. Kimball?
I'll say two things. So we at NMHC have worked with John, just in my short time there, on a couple of really extraordinarily impactful federal policies. First, it was tax reform, and right now, presently, it's housing finance reform and what we're going to ultimately do with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA. And John has helped put us as an organization in the room with a lot of federal policymakers to have those conversations. And I think it's extraordinarily important. The next big fight that we're going to have is around this issue of housing affordability and rent control. John mentioned some research we did last year, and we're going to be spending more money making more investments in the area of research going forward. We just this week rolled out a new website that is part of a sort of public relations platform. So we're going to be doing everything from old school radio to targeted digital and Twitter advertising. And it's called Growing Homes Together. I encourage you to go on the NMHC website and take a look at it. But the entire design of the program is kind of around what Richard described, which is speaking on behalf of the multifamily industry with empathy and still saying rent control is not the solution. So we need to have the correct message, we need to come up with solutions, and we need to make sure that we as an industry are investing our resources so that we are being heard.
We had a couple of questions about the timeline for AB 1482, which is the rent control bill, they call it, price gouging. The timeline on that is that it's moved out of the Assembly. It is going over to the Senate. The amendments are not yet in print. I'm guessing that that bill probably gets set for hearing in about 4 to 5 weeks, its first hearing. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes on that measure, so you're probably talking 4 to 5 weeks. The other thing I would say is that for those of you that are not aware, Prop 10 2.0 is basically out there. We anticipate that Mr. Weinstein will probably go out for signatures, start signatures probably in about 2 to 3 weeks. We're already polling to figure out what the point is that we can go after it on is. And once again, we'll never talk about rent control because we don't win on that. The good news is our first brush on that, sort of a focus group that we ran, it's beatable, but we will not talk about rent control. And last but not least, whatever all of you think is, you gotta understand, you're in real estate, you understand economics. The voters do not. You cannot make that step for them. What we found out, and I'll cut this off quickly, is homeowners, Republicans, Democrats, no matter what you are, they all either have children, they have children's friends, they have neighbors who find it very difficult to find a place to rent because the rent is high. So we got to figure out how we communicate at the same time increase supply. Very difficult in California because of the initiative process.
Henry?
I think in summary, this is a good sign that there is a problem with this because there's record employment in this country, and Simon gave you the stats. Rents are high, things are great. US, God bless America, a great country to be in. I recently, this year, traveled a little bit. I was in Egypt, meeting with President al-Sisi, and then we went on a second trip to Morocco. And you don't really appreciate how wonderful America is. You see some of these countries as beautiful, as exotic as they are. There is 47% unemployment in Egypt for 102 million people. We don't have that here. There's unfinished projects in Cairo, skyscrapers, half done. Morocco, 42% unemployment, people on the streets. So you don't have rent issues there because there's poverty. So I think this is a better problem to have. And despite that, if we're going to have another recession, because I think the market is definitely topping out, and that's why rents being pushed. If there is going to be a recession at some point, all this talk will go away, because God forbid rents will go down again like in 2008. So that's my message. I hope so.
All right. And batting cleanup, Professor Green.
So I think the most important thing we can do, although this is probably not going to happen, is fix zoning. CEQA creates a problem because it basically means zoning's not zoning. If we just had a zoning in Southern California that reflected the fact that it is now one of the 20 largest metropolitan areas in the world, people haven't quite internalized that. But also that you had certainty, which is to say, if the zoning code says, here's the building envelope that you're allowed, here's the use that you're allowed, and if you bring your plans and they meet what the zoning says, it's ministerial, you get your permit. If we could just, and by the way, that's the way things work in all kinds of places around the world. If we could just do that, that 35% soft cost number you're talking about would go down precipitously. Yes. I don't know by how much. And so if you want to think about something that's doable, in principle it is. Now what's the problem is we have this very corrupt system of bespoke zoning. And so city council people love the fact that they determine what changes in zoning happen, because it means that they get campaign contributions as a result of that. And it seems to me that there could be a political case that that's bad for everybody. And so attacking that on the grounds that it is both inefficient and leads to corruption might be an effective thing to do politically. I don't know if the political guys can agree or disagree with me. But that's, if I were to ask what is job one to fix this problem, fixing zoning would be it.
Right. And with that, thank you very, very much for sticking around. Thank you very much to our panel. And